This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
And welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Lhotka. Today in studio, we have Billy Thomas. Billy is an extension forester in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky, and it's a pleasure having you in studio today.
Well, Renee, Laura, thank you all for having me. I really love this show and what you all are doing with it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about timber harvesting do's and don'ts. But before we get started, we want a little bit about your background and what you do at UK, if you don't mind telling us.
Sure. I'm an extension forester here at the University of Kentucky, and what that means is I extend the university and forestry issues. I help woodland owners take care of their woods by informing them of opportunities and assistance that's available to them. I put on workshops and develop publications, all geared toward really taking care of our woods or forests here in Kentucky and helping those that work with them get the most out of them. So I really enjoy my job. I get to work with county extension agents across the state, and that's a great resource for your listeners out there. If they're not familiar with their local county extension office, I really encourage them to get to know those folks. They're really good people, and they're really trying to help, and we try to support them with forestry related issues that come up.
Okay, so let's get the basis started here.
Sure.
So tell us what a timber harvest is and who's involved, so we kind of even know what we're talking about.
Sure. Well, timber harvesting can really elicit a lot of strong responses, right? Some people are adamantly opposed to timber harvesting, and some people think it's really a great thing. And probably the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, as
Right.
with most things. But timber harvesting, I really want your listeners and anybody that's ever thinking about it to think of timber harvesting as a tool. It's really a tool that you use when it's appropriate, right?
Right.
If you need to screw something in, you use a screwdriver. If you need to hammer a nail in, you use a hammer.
Right.
If you need to harvest your timber, you want to do it the correct way and use timber harvesting as that tool. So I want to kind of set that stage. Don't go into it just blindly. It takes a long time to grow trees, especially here in Kentucky. So if we're going to harvest them, we want to make sure we're doing it right. But also, very importantly, we want to make sure that we're setting the future forest up to be successful. And when you do a timber harvest, that is one of the biggest impacts on that forest land, and it's an opportunity to really set the stage for that future forest if we do it right. So I encourage your listeners, if you're going to have a timber harvest, you really want to work with a professional forester and have it well thought out well in advance. And there are some things that we can do in advance of a timber harvest to help make sure that things go the way we want to go after the timber harvest. So it takes some time, it takes some planning, and I would say the biggest thing is go in well informed. It's really hard to put those trees back up after we cut them down.
Right. And how do they get informed?
Right. There's a number of resources available to help people when it comes to timber harvesting. I get calls often from landowners interested in selling their timber. They may have gotten a knock on the door of somebody offering to buy it, and they ask me questions about what can I do, what's my timber worth, and unfortunately the answer is almost always, well, it depends. The answer depends on a lot of different factors that come in to a timber harvest. Certainly the species that you have are important as far as what's valuable from a commercial standpoint. The quality of those trees is really important. Are they nice and clean as far as no defects? Are they big? How far are they spread out? Do you have to go long distances between trees? How close are you to a mill where they can be processed? What's the access on your property? All of those things come into play when we start thinking about timber harvest and how to make them successful for everybody involved. So to get informed, you really need to be working with a forester, in my opinion. Now, of course, I'm a forester, so that may not come as a shock that I'm telling your listeners to work with a forester. But really, I think it's the best bet for landowners to have a timber harvest that they're going to be satisfied with. And it has the best potential to set that forest up to be successful in the future. We can really go in and mess things up if we do timber harvest incorrectly. And we don't want that. Right. We want to make sure that if we're going to conduct a timber harvest, that we're doing it really soundly and we have a real eye to the future and what's going to happen to that forest land. So using that timber harvest as a management tool is really key to make sure that you get what you want in the future.
And by the way, it sounds there's not one set key or path for every timber harvest.
There's really not. It depends on, again, some of those factors I mentioned before, but also depends on the landowner's objectives. A landowner may not want a severe timber harvest as far as like the volume that's coming out. They may be wanting to do it just to maybe clear a little area for a cabin or for trails for recreational purposes. So really those landowners' objectives really need to come into that timber harvest planning, right? You're going to have to live with that area after the timber harvest. So we want to do it in a way that sets it up to be successful for your objectives.
Okay.
So who else involved with that, with the timber harvest?
Right. Well, it really starts with the woodland owner, right? The woodland owner controls the land. They are the owner of the land, and we have strong private property rights here in the United States, and the woodland owner really dictates what happens on that property for the most part. So first and foremost, I would say the woodland owner is the key. They are the ones who get to decide which trees to harvest. Now, they may not know that themselves, what's the best one, but working through a forester, they can get that information. But ultimately, really, it's the landowner's decision which trees are harvested. Whether they get assistance with that or not is another question, but it starts with the landowner. And I would say it really needs to extend beyond just that immediate landowner. I would encourage landowners that are thinking about a timber harvest to reach out to people that are involved with that property. This may be other family members, this may be partners or whatever, whoever has some stake in that property, especially some of the people that may be around to care for that property long term, getting them involved and making them a part of that is really important. So heirs is another thing. If your kids are going to be the owners of that land eventually, get them engaged, get them involved early in that process. So I would include them. So your family members are really important. You also need to kind of let your neighbors know, right, that you're having a timber harvest. And we have a timber trespass law in Kentucky that dictates that if you let your neighbors know via certified mail at least 7 days in advance that you're having a timber harvest, it gives them a chance to check the boundaries and make sure that we're in agreement. But if you do that, if you follow that, and a timber trespass happens, or after you've already sent that out, then you would only be responsible for 1 times the damages, or whoever did the trespass. If you do not do that, it makes you liable for 3 times the damages. So it could
Big
really
difference.
go. Plus, it's just being a good neighbor, right? You just want to let your neighbors know what's going on, and so they're well informed. It's just being a good neighbor. So your neighbors need to be informed as well. And then, of course, I mentioned it before, I think a forester needs to be involved in timber harvest. And unfortunately, very few of our timber harvests involve a professional forester. Part of that's because we don't have a lot of them here in Kentucky, but a big reason I think is landowners don't realize they need a professional forester involved in that. So work with a professional forester to set up your timber harvest to help you long term for your property, and they're uniquely positioned to do that. So foresters are involved, obviously, or I think they should be. Some of the others that you might want to think about getting involved with, an attorney may be important, especially to review contracts and other legal documents. They can help in a number of different ways, or tax specialists as well, because the way you treat that timber harvest can have an impact on the taxes that you pay on it. So you want to do it in a way that, you want to do it legally, of course, but you want to do it in a way that minimizes your tax liability on that. And there are ways that can be done to help you do that. Others that you might think about, I mentioned foresters, but there's also consulting foresters out there. That's kind of a unique kind of professional forester. They're really private businessmen here in Kentucky. We don't have any women at the moment, but they're private foresters that work for clients. And they can develop management plans for their clients, and they can help them implement management practices. But really where their specialty is in helping landowners navigate the timber sale process. They can represent the landowner to loggers and to potential timber buyers. They can help mark the timber. They can help draw up the contracts. They can reach out. They can show the timber as appropriate. And they can kind of advise the landowner on loggers that they may want to work with, or loggers that they may not want to work with. So a professional forester, but a consulting forester within that category can really be beneficial to landowners, especially if you don't really know what you have or what it's worth or who might buy it. Unfortunately, that's most of our landowners in Kentucky. They just don't have that information. Now, you talk to a farmer and they deal with their crops or their livestock on an annual basis. They have the ability to build up expertise over time, and they can really navigate, that sale process of their commodities. But for landowners, they may only do one timber harvest in their lifetime. So it doesn't really afford the opportunity to build up that knowledge and that expertise and that network and those connections. So that's why working with a professional forester can really be an
But that
important
consulting forester already has all those connections.
They really do.
And knowledge.
Yeah. And then the ultimate question is, well, how much is my timber worth, right? And we're talking back to your question, Laura, about who should be involved. And that's the timber buyer, right? Ultimately, somebody is going to have to hand over cash or a check or deposit money into an account for that timber. And that's really how you know how much your timber's worth. Right? Well, somebody is willing to pay for it, right? And until they pay for it, you really don't know. I mean, we can make estimates, right, based on the quality and all those other factors I mentioned before, but ultimately that sale is what says the value of that timber in the marketplace at that point. So I would encourage your listeners to engage all of those people in a timber harvest. You want as many resources supporting your decisions. You want to go in well informed. Again, we want to do all this before the harvest, because after the harvest, it's a whole new ball game that we're dealing with.
And who does the harvest?
Right. We have loggers, obviously, across the state of Kentucky, and we have a group called Kentucky Master Loggers. They've been trained to protect water quality. So they go through a 3-day training that's put on jointly by the Kentucky Division of Forestry and UK Department of Forestry and Natural Resources to train them on how to install or implement timber harvest in a way that minimizes impacts to water quality. Now, they've not been trained in that program to be foresters, but they do know a lot about timber harvesting, obviously, and where they're really going to shine is taking care of water quality. So those would be another group that's involved, obviously, in the timber harvest. Now, sometimes these loggers may be independent loggers, and they may work on their own. They may buy the timber themselves and then merchandise it and sell it to mills, or they may work on behalf of a mill or somebody else to actually do the harvesting, and they may just be kind of more contract labor. So that's another group that would be part of that sale. And you can find out on the internet through our website, KentuckyMasterLogger.org. We'll get you to a list of master loggers here in Kentucky, and you can search by county. So that's a good opportunity for your listeners to find out loggers in their area. And that website also has the phone number and the address of those loggers as well. So those are another group that's involved with it as well.
Okay, so if you're conducting a timber harvest, is there a certain age that trees need to be before you do that?
Yeah, well, it's really market driven. And what we've seen recently is that we've seen smaller and smaller trees being harvested, and especially like in our white oak category. White oak is a really hot species right now. It's really important to the bourbon industry, but it's also important in a lot of other uses. So there's a lot of demand for white oak right now. And what we've seen with that demand is we've seen some trees that really might have been better off staying in the woods for a few more years are being harvested. So really the market drives what is harvested, Renee. It really does. So, ultimately, we want you, if you're going to have a timber harvest, one school of thought is you want to get it to the point where those trees have stopped putting on good wood and have stopped being productive, right? So that whatever age or size that is, they've reached their kind of economic maturity. And that can vary by species quite a bit. It really can.
And getting a forester could
They can help you navigate that too. But basically, if the trees still have a very vigorous crown and they're growing well and they don't seem to have any problems, they could probably continue to grow for quite a few years. Trees that are kind of declining or the crowns aren't looking too good or there's some other problems going on, those would be better candidates to be harvested, right? So it's going to really depend. There is no set size, and a lot of times timber harvest will happen basically set on a size. So they may say, well, we're going to cut everything greater than 14 inches or 16 or 18 or whatever number comes up. And, I try to caution landowners away from that because what happens with that is you're not really thinking about the future of the forest too much with that. You might be thinking that, all right, I'm cutting the bigger trees, so I'm making room for the smaller trees, but sometimes those smaller trees won't respond. And without having a forester involved with that, you may not know that. So just picking trees based on a minimum size is not really what we would recommend. Sometimes it works out that way, but generally you want a forester in there kind of picking each tree that's going to be harvested.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. You mentioned a few reasons for harvesting your timber, kind of economic reasons. What are some other reasons why somebody might want to harvest the timber off of their land?
Sure. Again, I think timber harvesting is such a unique thing. Again, it elicits strong emotions and strong responses, but if we seize the opportunity with it, we can really get a lot out of a timber harvest. And so some of the things that you might want to do is you might want to change your forest composition, and you can use that timber harvest to help change and guide what's going to be successful in the future. You can also use it as an opportunity to get some access roads into your property, because when we're using a timber harvest, we have to move equipment up in there, and we have to pull those logs out of there. But when we're doing that, it creates a great opportunity to put in roads that you can have for access, for management, or recreational purposes later. So combining that timber harvest with the installation of those roads that you can use later is a huge benefit for a lot of landowners, because one of the challenges for many of our landowners to manage their properties, they don't have access to it. It's hard to get to it, and it's hard to navigate it. Putting these roads in can help address that. Those roads can also help serve as fire breaks as well. So that's kind of another added benefit. If you've got these clean roads, it's really hard for the ground fires to kind of move across them. So that's another one. Another good reason is to improve wildlife habitat. We can use timber harvest in ways that really set up that stand to be very attractive to certain wildlife species. And that's going to depend. Certain wildlife species like different compositions of trees and different densities of trees. So again, working with a professional, they can help you set that timber harvest up in a way to make that property attractive to the species you're trying to attract. So that's a really good one. Another one is you can use it as kind of a cleanup operation or a salvage operation. You may have some damaged trees, you may have some sick trees, you may have some ice storm damaged trees. Could be a wide variety of damaged or sick trees. Emerald ash borer is another one. So we can use a timber harvest there to kind of clean up the woods, right? Remove some of that damaged material, stop some things from maybe spreading as well by getting some of that stuff out of there. And ultimately, by taking out some of those sick and dying trees, it frees up growing space for other trees that you want to grow there. So that, that's a good reason why we want to do it. And another reason, maybe you want to do some practices on your property, but you don't have the funds for them. You can use the proceeds from a timber sale to implement some of those. So I always encourage landowners to take a little bit of that money off of that timber sale that they receive and reinvest it back into the property in regards to practices that really improve the woods for the long term and for the next generation. So those are just a few ways that, a timber harvest can really be a management tool and help you achieve other objectives.
If we're cutting down all these trees, are we running out of trees?
That's a good question, Renee. And fortunately, the answer is no, right? We have the luxury of having the Kentucky Division of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service conduct an annual inventory of Kentucky's forests. So they've been doing this for a long time. So each part of the state is visited on a rolling basis. Within every 5 years, every part of the state is touched in this inventory process. And so we got a good handle on how much volume we have out there and how that's changed over time. And the good news is that we're not running out of trees, right? We actually have a few more trees than we did 70 years ago, or a few more percentage, like 3% more forest area than we did 70 years ago. So that's a good thing. So overall, we are growing about twice as much saw timber volume, and that's trees that are big enough to be sawn into lumber and boards. We're growing about twice as much as we harvest here in the state. So that it's not a concern in that regard. But that's not really the full story either, because while we're growing overall that volume, there are a few species that are being hit particularly hard as far as being harvested. Oaks make up a big portion of our forest, but they make up over 50% of the harvested volume in Kentucky. And if you kind of narrow that down even further, white oaks account for 16% of the entire volume that's harvested in Kentucky. So it's kind of a big deal for one species to represent that much. Yes, overall, we're doing really great. For a few species, we may be hitting them a little too hard, and we may have some longer term concerns for some of those. And that's one of the reasons like the White Oak Initiative has been developed to try to look at white oak trees and how we can do practices that will make sure that we have white oak going forward into the future.
If I have a timber harvest, do I need to plant acorns to get my trees to come back?
That's a really good question. And a lot of landowners believe that if once we cut the trees down, you have to go back and plant.
Right.
And out west, where we're dealing with conifers, that is kind of the way you have to do forestry, and that's the way they do it largely out there. They will basically replant after harvest. Fortunately, in our native hardwood stands here, you do not have to do that. We have an abundant amount of seed source and rootstock in the ground already after timber harvest that will thrive. It will basically explode. You almost have to get out of the way. It's going to grow back so fast. So one of the challenges then, if you were to go in and plant acorns or other seedlings or other things like that, it's going to be hard for those to survive most of the time, because you're putting in a small little seedling or an acorn even, and it's having to compete with the sprouts from these trees that have giant root systems under the ground. So they'll quickly get out competed. So generally, we do not have to replant after a harvest here in Kentucky. There is the exception if you're wanting to change the species composition and you do not have those species present. So if you wanted to change your forest to a white oak forest and there's no white oak around, then we're going to have to come in and do some planting. But I will tell you, it takes a lot of work to get those trees to survive and be successful in a cutover forest, just because of the response that happens so quickly after a harvest.
And working with a forester, they would be able to help you say what trees could stick around to help with that.
And even which trees are appropriate. You know, you may have dreams that you've heard that walnut's really valuable and it's a great species and you want to plant your entire property into walnut, but your property may not be good for growing walnut, right? So without working with a forester and knowing some of that stuff, you may be setting yourself up for some problems down the road. So.
And what size property would you recommend people have to do these types of timber harvests?
Right. Again, the beautiful forestry answer is it depends, right? There is some minimums that loggers will want to deal with. You know, we typically think you need to have anywhere around 3,000 board feet to an acre. And that's basically, if you could imagine looking at a forest, that trees that you could harvest out of there that would give you 3,000 board feet of lumber. And a board foot is just a 12 by 12 by 1 inch board, if you can imagine. So visualize, you got to get at least about 3,000 out of there as a general rule of thumb. Now that can vary though. If you're dealing with certain really high value species or prize species, like walnut or white oak or some of the species that are really hot, then you can get by with less volume because there's more value in them. But typically you're going to have probably 5 to 10 acres at a minimum of that, and that may not be attractive to very many buyers. It really might not, or loggers, just because it's so expensive to move equipment and to relocate your operation. So you got to make sure that movement is justifying your time and harvest there. So I would really encourage you to talk to a professional, visit with a consultant forester, and kind of feel that out. We're not really going to be doing much timber harvesting in backyards for the most part, you know. So these do need to have a little bit of size. The property needs to have a little bit of size. But again, if you've got a small property and it's got really high quality stuff and it's easy to access, you very well could find somebody to buy that, and you might find multiple people interested in it. Again, there's just a lot of variability in that, so working with a forester will help you kind of make those decisions.
Okay. Well, so someone came and knocked at my door and wanted to say, hey, I'm doing a timber harvest next door. I can take some of your trees out too and get you some money. What should you do?
What I tell landowners is they may be giving you a good price, but they may not as well, right? I always tell landowners you want as many people to bid on your timber as possible. That way you let the market work for you.
Right.
So if you just take that first knock on the door, it's really hard to say what somebody else might have paid you for it. I'm not saying that loggers are giving you a bad price, because some of them are maybe giving you a very fair price right off the bat. But you don't know that. And until you kind of go through that process and have others kind of evaluate your timber. First, I would say don't cut it if you're not ready to cut it. If you've been thinking about a timber harvest, that's one thing. But if you haven't been thinking about it and you really are reluctant to do it, then probably don't harvest your timber, because you're not going to be happy with what happens afterwards. But if you are entertaining that thought, that's the signal. If you get that knock on the door, that's the signal that you need to get more information. And you need to reach out to some of these professionals that we've mentioned before and get you that information so you can make an informed decision. Again, you don't want to rush into these things. For the most part, trees will continue to grow, and we have some time before there's not an immediate rush, unless you're dealing with some kind of disaster or emerald ash borer or some
college
of those.
Tuition.
Right. And that's what happens a lot. Our landowners think of our woods out there as basically bank accounts that they can draw on when there's a crisis or when there's some need. And we encourage them not to think of those like that. Think of them as an asset that you want to manage and you want to cultivate. You want to get the most out of that. So if you get that knock on the door, that's a signal that you need to find out more information and reach out to some professional help and get a feel for really what you've got, what you want to sell, and what's a fair price for it before you make a decision.
Okay, so if you do get a knock on the door and it's a logger, how can you check? I know you mentioned the Master Logger website, but how can you check if they're good or bad loggers out there? Who will be able to tell you that?
Right. Well, and I'll extend that kind of thought maybe a little beyond good and bad loggers. Loggers have different sets of equipment. They have different sets of skills. They have different sets of experience. So certain loggers can be really good on your property, right? Because those things align.
Right.
Other loggers may not have experience with your conditions or what you've got. It may be a little more challenging for them to do the same type of jobs, right? It makes perfect sense.
It does.
So what I would recommend is basically you need to interview these loggers more or less. And it doesn't have to be you. It can be your professional forester can help you. But you really want to kind of get a feel for what they're going to do with your woods. You want to feel comfortable with how it's going to be left. You also want to kind of understand how they merchandise that. So if you're going in on a shares basis where the logger gets a certain share and you get a certain share of the timber proceeds, you really want to understand how they're merchandising those trees. You hope they're merchandising them to maximize their value, which in turn will maximize what you can get into it. I guess the only other thing I would mention, and on our Kentucky Master Logger website, we do have a listing of bad actors. And what that means, these are loggers that have been found in violation of timber harvesting laws associated with water quality. So if somebody's on that bad actor list, it may not be somebody you want to work with. But I would encourage you to visit with your forester and get some advice from them and really understand if those loggers are a good fit for your property and what you're trying to accomplish.
And you mentioned the regulations that loggers have to follow. Can you explain to our listeners why it's important that they do follow the certain practices and how that helps the water quality when they do follow, and maybe what they are following?
Sure. Certainly, the Kentucky Forest Conservation Act was enacted way back in 2000, and it set up that in order to have a commercial timber harvest, there had to be a Kentucky Master Logger on it here in Kentucky. And that was really a response to water quality concerns that we were having, not only here in Kentucky, but throughout the United States. So there was concern that there was a lot of sediment and other things coming off of timber harvesting operations, finding their way into our waterways. So it was an attempt to try to address that. And what that meant was that loggers would have to go through a training program. so that they could understand what we call best management practices. And these are practices that are intended to really protect water quality. So it really has a lot to do with where we place roads, where we harvest timber, and how we revegetate these properties afterwards. If you have a trail and a landing, there are some vegetative mixes that we can put on there, some grasses and some other things that can kind of hold that soil in place. So there's a number of different best management practices that are in place, address a wide variety of water quality related issues. So master loggers have been trained on these practices and how to implement them. So by following these best management practices, we have the opportunity to protect water quality for our communities and really for all of us. So it's a good thing, and it's really required by law.
Okay.
So you recommend, with timber harvesting to use, a forester, a professional trained forester with that. And I know we've had on our show John Lhotka talking about silviculture. We've also had Jim Rins talking about forestry careers and getting those foresters out there and what they do. But can you explain a little bit why foresters are important and what their knowledge is that they bring to kind of the timber harvest?
Yeah, that's a great point, Laura. Yeah, the reason we recommend working with foresters is because they have been trained. They have the education and they have the exposure on how trees grow, the ecology associated with our forests, the impacts that different practices will have not only on wildlife species but on the trees that are currently growing and the trees that can grow there. They understand, obviously, economics associated with forests, but they really understand the scientific background of how trees grow and how trees respond to different practices. So having them involved with that timber harvest is a way to make sure that your forest is going to be in the best shape possible going forward. So you're really drawing upon their training and their experience that they have to implement a timber harvest that really helps you achieve your goals. So please work with a professional forester on these.
You've written an article, and we'll post that on the website, about timber harvesting do's and don'ts. So if you can kind of go over some of those with our listeners on what they should and should not do.
Well, when we are talking about timber harvesting, it's something that landowners don't do frequently, right? So it's kind of a special issue or special case because you don't have that experience and that knowledge. So we want to make sure, again, we're going in well informed with those. But a few things I will kind of highlight and then I'll talk about in the article are, please find professional assistance. Whether that's a service forester with the Kentucky Division of Forestry, whether that's a consulting forester, or even working with an industry forester. We do have a few industries that hire foresters that work with landowners as well. So start with some professional assistance, right? And also reach out to some of those other professionals. We talked about your tax preparers or attorneys or others that need to be involved in that decision making. And then I would encourage you to use that timber harvest as a management tool. And we talked about some of the reasons why you would want to do that. But again, this is a time we've got a lot of activity going on in the woods. Let's make the most of it. Let's do things that are also moving us toward our objectives and goals for the property. I would also encourage your listeners to make sure if you're going to have a timber harvest to use a written contract. It's really important, and because it may take a while before these trees are harvested, and if you just had a quick conversation with somebody, there could be the opportunity for misunderstandings, right? I thought you said you were only going to do this, but you did that. But if we have it in writing, then we all know what we've agreed to do.
And signed.
Yeah. Also know what's going to be harvested. We know the boundary. So always have a written contract. It protects not only the landowner, but it protects the logger as well. The other thing I would say is, once you decide you're going to have a timber harvest, really, your job's not done. You need to kind of keep an eye on that harvest. You need to monitor it to some extent. And if you're working with a professional forester, they'll probably take care of that largely. But you just want to make sure that that harvest is being conducted the way you all agreed. And you're making sure that if there's any follow-up practices, you're attentive to them. Perhaps we start noticing some invasive species popping up after a timber harvest. We want to be able to get in there and treat them. So don't just walk away after you've made the decision that you're going to do a timber harvest. And then I guess finally I would say is don't treat your woodlands as a bank account that you just draw down when you have a crisis. Treat them as an asset worthy of your attention and worthy of management. And then they'll be more valuable to you when you do have that crisis and when you do need to harvest, if that's what's really driving that decision. So treat them as a farm asset. They really are an asset. You're paying taxes on them. Why not get the most out of them? So working with professionals will allow you to do that. So those would be some quick timber harvesting do's. And then talking about some of the don'ts, they're kind of, in some ways, are really the mirror opposite of the do's.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Again, we want you to have a written management plan for your property. And that is available through working with a forester. But the thing about that is that makes sure that timber harvest is a component of what you're trying to do with your property in the long term. It's not just a willy-nilly running out here and cutting some trees. Right. We're cutting these trees because they achieve these objectives. It frees up space for us to let other species grow or whatever. So have a written management plan is important before you have a timber harvest. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier with the question is don't necessarily take that first offer. You want to make sure that you're ready for a timber harvest. You want to make sure that your woods are ready for a timber harvest. And again, we mentioned some of the practices that we can do prior to a timber harvest to help ensure that. If you take that first offer, you may not have the ability to do some of those practices and set yourself up. And you also want to make sure that you're receiving a fair price, and one of the best ways you can do that is get as many people bidding on your timber as possible. So that's another one. The other one I would say, again, don't rely on verbal agreements. They will cause you some problems. Memories get faulty, and misunderstandings happen, so written contracts always are important. And try not to do a timber harvest that ends up hurting the overall value and potential of your woodlands. We don't want to do practices that are limiting what those woods can do in the future. So marking the trees appropriately as far as which ones are coming out is important. Marking trees that are still growing and leaving them alone for the future can be important depending on the stand. So make sure that you conduct that harvest in a way that improves the stand or sets that stand up to be more successful in the future. And finally, I would say don't go into this process uninformed. It is such a big deal as far as the impact, the visual impact on you, the financial impact as well, tax implications. There's a lot of things that are in play with the timber harvest. Not that any of them are insurmountable, but you want to make sure you're going in well informed so that you can make good decisions that really set you and your forest up to be the way you want it to be and to help you achieve your objectives in the future. Well, I thank you for the opportunity, and again, I encourage your listeners to reach out to some of those professionals. They can always find out more information by visiting us online at ukforestry.org or give us a call at 859-257-7597, and we'll be happy to try to help answer any questions folks might have.
Great. Well, thank you, Billy. And you've given us a lot of great information today. And what would be a kind of a takeaway item you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I will say that our forests and our woodlands are valuable. They're really important. They provide many assets. They provide many ecosystem services, and they are just a big part of who we are here in Kentucky. So treat your forests or your woodlands as an asset. And if it comes to timber harvesting, make sure you're doing it right in a well thought out plan, and you're working with the professional assistance that's available out there.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, Billy, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you've heard in this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
Okay, Matt, what was that sound?
So that was an eastern hognose snake hissing, which is one of the things they'll do when they're defensive or scared. They'll put on quite a show, and today we were lucky enough to have Dr. Steve Price, a faculty member within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, who's an associate professor, and he's a herpetologist and works with snakes.
And brought a friend.
Our actual producer of said sound.
Right. Yeah, so I brought with me a female hognose snake that we've had in our lab for about 4 or 5 years. She's probably about 8 or 9 years old. Okay. The reason they get that common name, hognose snake, is they have a little upturned scale right at the tip of their nose. Okay, so it kind of resembles a pig or a hog, and they use that to burrow through sandy soils, and most of the time when they're doing that, they're looking for their favorite food, which is toads. Right, toads will bury themselves, and these guys love eating toads.
Now, they have a special feature that helps them do that, right? Because toads are infamous for blowing up.
Yeah.
The toad would be much bigger than this thing we're looking at.
So the toads try to avoid being eaten by filling themselves up with air and making themselves looking really big and hard to swallow. And the hognose snake has enlarged teeth kind of in the back of its mouth. And it'll actually, when it starts to bite that toad, it will pop it and deflate it.
Like a balloon.
Yeah, like a balloon, and then it can swallow that toad without it getting stuck in its throat.
A really cool feature for something. That,
Yeah.
Now, how old is this snake?
We think it's probably like 8 or 9 years old.
And it's how long would you say?
Oh, I don't know, maybe
2.5?
Yeah, 2.5 feet. Yeah.
And what does it eat besides toads? I mean, anything, or is that...
Well, in the wild, they eat a lot of toads and some other amphibians. They'll eat salamanders and frogs as well. Yeah, we've trained this guy to eat mice in the lab because it's hard to find enough toads all year round. Yeah, to feed it.
Now, they have a distinctive pattern, and actually, if you go on our website for the show, you'll see a picture of Dr. Price holding the snake.
Yeah, I just took it. So if you guys heard a click, that's why.
Yes. So they have a distinctive pattern, which sometimes gets them in trouble with some folks because what other species of snakes would you say people can get confused with the hognose snake?
Yeah, well, I would say that sometimes a real dark hognose snake, because of its heavy-bodied nature and because it hisses, people think it's a cottonmouth. Okay. Sometimes, like this one that has a little bit of a pattern, people would get confused it maybe with a rattlesnake. They have a lot of interesting common names besides hognose snake. People call them like a hissing adder or a blow viper or things like that, and they think they're venomous pit viper, but they are not.
And that's a good preview for a show we're going to in the future about interesting nicknames of wildlife species.
Yeah.
So, this one has a couple of them.
Right.
Now, on top of the hissing, they do an interesting other behavior that can sometimes throw people off if they come across it.
Yeah, sure. If you come across one of these in the wild, the first thing they do, they'll hiss, and they kind of inflate their neck, similar to the way a cobra would do. Okay? And if you keep harassing the snake, they'll strike at you, but they'll do it with their mouth closed, so they won't do it with their mouth open. Okay? If you continue to bother the snake, it'll release a really foul-smelling musk, as well as some feces, and kind of smear it all over its body and just make it really overall disgusting. Continued harassment will lead to it throwing up whatever it has last eaten. I've caught these guys, or captured these guys before, and holding it, and all of a sudden a toad comes out like onto your lap. Okay, but the coolest thing is if you keep messing with them, they will roll over onto their backs, open their mouths, stick their tongue out, and play dead. If you take a few steps,
like a possum.
Like a possum. If you take a few steps back from the snake, it'll actually lift up its head and see where you're at. And if you come close again, it's dead again. So they'll play dead like that until the harassment has passed. And it's a really unusual defensive behavior, and we think it just confuses predators. Like, what the heck is going on with this animal? Maybe I shouldn't be eating it. So.
Now, in no way are we promoting you to go out and harass snakes
Right.
to try to get this behavior, especially if you're not very good at identifying the species, because if you do that to other species, you may not end up out a snake bite.
Right.
Yeah.
So these guys are fairly, temperament-wise, they're fairly calm compared to, say, like a black racer, right?
Right, yeah. These guys don't bite as a defensive behavior and rely on those unusual behaviors to avoid predation, whereas something like a black racer, well, if you grab it, it won't hesitate to bite.
So do they see well? They have big eyes. Looks like this one does.
Yeah, well, hognose snakes actually don't see that well compared to some of our other species. They more track their prey through the sense of smell. And when a snake is sticking its tongue out, that's what it's doing. It's smelling the air. It's capturing little chemical particles in the air. And it's bringing it back to a special organ in the roof of its mouth and tells them where those prey are. The forked tongue actually provides directionality, right? So if one of the tips has more chemicals on it than another, it can go in that direction and track their prey. prey. So sense of smell is very important for all snakes, especially important for hognose snakes. There's some other species that we have in Kentucky that can see quite well, though, and probably use visual detection of prey.
So, Dr. Price, thank you for bringing the snake in and providing us some really great snake information there, talking about the tongue and directionality. You're going to come back and join us here on April 8th for a full show, talk a lot more about snakes and snake ecology and some of the work you're doing here in the department. So if you folks would like to learn more about snakes, please tune in for our show on April 8th, and we'll go from there.
Thank you for joining us today, and we have a new show schedule for spring 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL 88.1 FM on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon. And if you miss the Monday shows, you can listen to our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.